but I do not know how I know. And I certainly can't say how I know. So I'm conscious that I have a tacit dimension, but I'm very incapable of telling you what makes that up. So think about those sorts of skills. You have them all over the place in many different activities. And they are rather different when it comes to teaching than knowing lots of words. Okay, next slide. So here we've got one implication of that. And I think that the word I want to focus on here is the word knowledge. Now, in the reading you had last week by Wells, there is a Vygotskian attack on the notion of knowledge. And in the first week, when Lauren Clark talked to you from the point of view of critical pedagogy, not at all the same thing as Vygotsky, although they can work together, but from the philosophy of critique, Lauren also quoted Freire, who said he greatly objected to the idea of what he called famously the banking model of knowledge. The idea that you have something as a teacher that you then transmit into the head of the student, where it's banked and they can take it away and use it. And both Freire with Lauren and also Wells with Vygotsky think that there is something dreadfully wrong with that concept of knowledge. So what might be wrong with it? And the answer that Vygotsky gives, or Wells's description of Vygotsky, is that when we talk about knowledge, what we're really talking about is action and interaction, and that develops. It's a becoming, not a being. It's something that changes as you do it. It doesn't have a fixed thingness that you can then store away as such. It's something that's constantly changing. So there we have two quite different writers, but they're headed in the same direction in terms of the tacit. And then at the bottom of this slide, there is a significant question, which is if we take on board the idea that a lot of knowledge is tacit, if a lot of knowledge practices are tacit practices, if a lot of our understanding of ourself is tacit and difficult to put into words, then might that also be true of highly specialized discursive practices? So let me give you a simple example. Mathematicians write discursively. They put a whole load of symbols one after the other and in lines that follow from each other. And there are all sorts of explicit principles about how to produce mathematics, which are endlessly discussed by mathematicians and which few of us, if any, would understand at all. It looks like it's a specialized discursive practice. But when you read biographies of mathematicians about how they came up with their Fields medal-winning mathematics, they say it was because they were listening to rock music, or they were dreaming, or they were, famously with one recent winner, on the beach, soaking up the sun. Something then happened that reconfigured their worldview in some way that they can't say, and suddenly more mathematics came about. So if you think of that, then even specialized discursive language is not self-contained. It can't, in some sense, contain the rules of its own production. There would be a regress if it tried to. So tacit knowledge may well be implicated in every knowledge practice to such an extent that it's actually perhaps the most important part of the production of that knowledge. This is something to think about when you hear future speakers. So the other thing that I think has arisen with our first couple of sessions is that, if you like, this course is making a claim about the word education. You may have come here thinking education was just in schools. And clearly schools are a major part of where education happens. But by no means are they the only part. So education happens all over the place. There will be moments of education wherever there is human interaction. So families, clubs, workplaces, workshops. We seem to have cut. Okay. So here is a picture of a school I used to teach in. This is a private school for highly selected pupils. The building is actually sort of stratified from the 12th century through to the 18th century. It's Westminster Abbey. You may be able to see the students are wearing gowns. And all those students are boys, because in that age group of the school, they only have boys in the school. Okay? I went on the internet. I wanted a picture of a less well-funded comprehensive school. So this is clearly a biased selection. What struck me about this picture is the temporary nature of the classrooms that they've erected in the front. So this is typical in schools which have got a shortage of resources. They put out temporary accommodation. Now, when we think of education, we can think of it as institutionalized in different settings. So the word institutionalized means that the practice by people engaged in it has been arranged in a certain way. So if you go to a private school, of the kind that I showed you a picture of initially, they will do a whole series of things and have a whole series of expectations which are very different to other schools. In that particular school, derived over the centuries. Yeah, just go on. Actually, go back for one minute. Let's just slightly change my mind. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video of a school, of a classroom. I'm only going to watch a bit of it. And the question is, from your new resources that you've acquired from listening to speakers so far and reading what you've read, what do you see? So you might think of yourself now as that moment where you do your first research in education. You're the camera operator in this case, as a film. And of course, what you will bring to that is a whole load of possible interpretations of what you see. So what have we had so far? We've had quite a lot of philosophy. We've had Dima talking to you about critical realism. You'll hear more about critical realism from Jacek tonight. We will have other philosophies. We will have anarchism and phenomenology. And then we've had some sociology. People who look at schools or other places of education as collective endeavors, where it's what you do with others that matters most. We've already heard about Bourdieu briefly. We're going to hear some Foucault. There was a mention last week of communities of practice in one of the readings. That's Slave and Wenger. We've had critical pedagogy, as we mentioned. And last week we had a range of psychologists, Vygotsky, Piaget, and Skinner. Now, what I put it to you is that when you see some empirical setting, And the video that you're going to see is just an empirical setting, somewhere where education happens. The empirical, the stuff that you're going to research, you have to throw at that empirical some concepts if you want to specialize your own research. So when you look at the actual practice you're interested in, you will have in mind, you will be informed by the reading that most attracted you and interested you in your studies, in your MA. So I don't know how successful I was last week in persuading you that Skinner was right about operative conditioning. Has anyone become a behaviorist since I talked to you last week? Few. But I'm guessing that many of you will be attracted by Piaget. It will resonate with some of your own experiences. But then others of you will take the Vygotsky line, which in subtle ways is very different from Piaget. And if you look at setting of interest, you will see it very differently according to whom is informing your research. So my view is that it is through these resources that you will be able to make something of what you see. So I'm going to do a little exercise, which is we're going to show you a bit of this film, and then I'm going to ask you to talk to the persons around you, perhaps 3 or 4 of you at a time, to answer this question. What do you see, and how does that relate to what you've read so far? So I need to come here and do this because I need to get to it. Once it's gone. No, you do it.
I'm Constance Cummings, and with me is Leslie Housman, the first grade teacher with whom I have been working for several years. Mathematics educators agree that we want children to have a deep understanding of mathematics rather than a memorized acquaintance with the subject.
Okay.
How many erasers need that? Anybody have a question?
So I need just to explain the question that the children are trying to answer. I'll read it out for you in case it's not clear. In the school store, erasers, those are rubbers to get rid of pencil marks, cost 5 cents each. Howard has saved 62 cents in his jar. How many erasers can he buy? Don't panic, it's only maths.
This videotape consists of 2 parts. In the first part, the teacher circulates among the children, interacting with them individually or in a small group. In the second part, she leads a whole class discussion about the different ways in which the children solve the problem. As you can see, the children begin by working alone because we want each child to have his or her own idea about how the problem can be solved. When the children have an answer, they usually compare notes with a neighbor and then choose a math game to play. What's an idea? Okay, we go here. Okay, tell me about all these lines, but I didn't know how many lines to draw. 62. Okay, so you drew the 62 cents, and then you circle 5 each time. Okay. Where do you circle 5?
Does this draw 5 cents to buy the eraser?
Okay. Do you know how many erasers you come up?
Two more left.
Two more left, two more.
Two more cents.
2 more cents. Can you buy any more erasers with that?
No.
Okay. Why couldn't you buy any more erasers with that?
I have to do 3 more cents left.
You can 3 more cents to get rid of coffee.
Most first graders think about 62 and 62 ones, as you have just seen. But a few, like the next child, think about 62 as groups of 5.
What about what you're getting, Bobby?
I use my 5s and put them in order, and then I put the numbers, and I put down the numbers like that. That's the first one, and then I got down to it, and when he has 60 cents, after that he has 62 cents, and it costs 60 cents for 12 cents. He had one more, and he can't, because then he has to have 65 cents. So it has to be 12.
About that? Mm-hmm. What about the other 2 cents?
Those you don't get, you just can't buy anything else with it.
How come?
Because that's not enough money to buy something, because it's only 2 cents, not 5 cents.
I see. How did you know that 5 pounds?
Because all of them cost 5 cents.
I see. Thank you, Ruth.
I'm
Tell me about what you did here.
Okay, so we've got a very simple lesson, and perhaps you could just now talk with 2 or 3, 4 people in a little group about what you might have made of that if you were researching this classroom. What sorts of observations? And don't worry about what the observations are. There's no right answer. There's probably an infinity of observations you could make about this sort of thing. So just for 3 or 4 minutes. Hi. Did you get your? Yes. You did. Excellent. Hello. Hi, G. How many choosers have we actually got tonight? Sonia is here. We're missing somebody, are we? Oh, Mira is over there. I have a panic. I have to have 7 people, otherwise it's disaster. We're trying to introduce a little video every 40 seconds, because otherwise they keep saying what's the effect about.
I really liked your idea of showing a snippet of a classroom and getting them now to discuss.
Yeah.
Because they will have different lenses.
Interestingly,
aware of that.
I'm going to say this, but on YouTube, this is presented as a Piagetian classroom. And later on, there's just an argument between the children about something, and it's very Vygotskian. Of tall Piagetian.
Yeah. And there's a lot of discussion there with the teacher going
Yeah.
on.
So let's find out what people are saying.
No, there's absolutely no mastery at work. That to me, that is a taught approach. There was no extension unless the teacher was saying, okay, what else could we do? She only did that as an after when the kids said, I've got 2 left over. And then she suddenly went, oh, well, great.
Yeah.
And then they said, oh, when they finished, you go
Is that Piaget approach of rewards for correct?
No, I think that's the Piaget approach of this is how much you should don't you dare look in
So age, stage, achieved it.
Because some of those kids are just not naturally, but they're going to have experience. That's why it's their way. There's no challenge for them.
Right.
There's going to be other kids that we didn't see that will struggle.
Can't even grasp the concept.
And where's the more supportive?
Is there something about the arrangement of the classroom might fit with some? Yeah. Well, I'm just walk around, but yeah. What did you come up with?
We noticed that the children have different methods when solving the problem, and
Yes.
also they have different answers. Yeah, and the first one got 12, and the second one got 13. Yeah, and then the second one actually got a better method
Yes.
compared with the first one, but the answer's wrong.
Yes.
Yeah, that's how.
So they might be a future great mathematician. They don't really care about the numbers. That's true of many mathematicians. They don't care about the numbers. Excellent. Did you know something about that? Call on you. Thank you.
Here we go.
Okay, well, we got some very interesting comments, and they're all quite they're all quite varied, actually. So I'm going to ask for any volunteer here. You mentioned that there was a lot of comparative difference that you noticed.
Yeah, so I just met him. He was sharing with me how what was shown on the video earlier on is actually quite similar to how it's like the pedagogy of it's quite similar in the UK. But I shared that from where I come from, actually at that age we don't necessarily contextualize such a problem to like a real life problem. Yeah, we just actually have students solve it. And we do have that, just that it comes on later on in the primary school. Yeah, so in our case, it will probably be a question of what's the answer of 62 divided by 5? And then we just quickly show our working, and then there's a remainder of 2. So I thought that was quite interesting.
So at that age, when I was at school also, because history is also a comparative thing, because these things shift over time, I was sitting in rows reciting my times tables. And we would certainly never have done anything like that, at least as I remember. It was much more proceduralized early on before these sorts of issues. Good. You have something very interesting about the kind of pedagogic assumptions or whatever.
Yeah, we thought it was interesting how she was encouraging different ways to get to the same answer. So there wasn't one set method.
So one of the things that struck me was that the children are each being encouraged to do their own method at this stage to solve the problem. They're all sitting individually to produce a solution with whatever they can do at the moment. Vygotsky or Piaget? Remember, Vygotsky is you learn by social interaction. Piaget is you have these stages of development and you have to do what you can within that stage of development. So it seems to me that there is a Piagetian assumption at work there. It wasn't really a collective discussion. It was more, let's see where you're at and what kind of method you're using at this stage. Interesting, later in the video, it gets quite Vygotskian, that is, they start having rows amongst the students. And then you begin to see a much more kind of social activity. Was anybody interested in the social side of the video? In terms of some of the social theorists we've heard from, or the critical pedagogues we've heard from, or any other aspect of it as a social phenomenon?
I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but it bothered me that we didn't see anybody fail. It was just, look at these wonderful children. We don't know how much prior work they've done. We don't know how much teacher input there's been. And I would have liked to have seen one child, even if it was the two approaches that worked, but have the two kids say, no, that's the wrong way to do it. No, it's not. I still get the same answer. That's just, it's too neat.
Yes, and this is actually part of a propaganda video in favor of a particular kind of teaching. In this case, actually, the YouTube video is called the Piaget method. I think the Piaget method that works or something. You know, it's one of those sorts of things. I have discovered how to do maths teaching. And as you say, one has to have suspicion about all these. When we looked at the videos last week, equally, there was a whole load of stuff that was quite troubling in many ways. Even though the result seems clear, the actual process is questionable and must be interrogated. And that's part of the art of the research attitude, if you like. What I'm interested in, though, is the social relations amongst the students. And I thought it's always interesting to see a real classroom where you have a dominant figure, in this case the teacher, with a video, and the children sometimes doing these kind of slightly worrying or anxious looks to the video, and then the child who's meant to produce answers to what seem sometimes to be rather odd questions. I thought particularly the end of the interview with the very first child, who'd got his 2 cents left over and knew it, and then she said, well, why can't you spend the 2 cents? And I got the sense that he kind of glanced at her as if she was an imbecile, and then looked away, and there seemed to me to be a kind of rather negative impression there of schooling as such, that we're sitting here doing. I may be reading too much into this, but I am interested in those differential positions that become obvious in such videos. Yeah.
That the fact that everyone got the right answer might mean that the math problem was too easy, and that or they edited the video so that.
Yes, for that particular video. Jolly good. Okay, so we're going to wrap up with it. We've got a little quiz in a minute with the usual prize, but let me just finish with a few more concepts. So I've got a couple of terms here that I think might be useful to you when you think about education. They're both in the literature. I've given you a reference at the bottom of the slide that you can click on later if you want to look at it. But the terms are that when you look at a classroom or any educational setting, you will see a fluctuation. Sometimes you will see pedagogic relations. Now, you know what the word pedagogy means. You've heard it endlessly. Pedagogic relations are where the transmitter of the education has control over the evaluation. What is 2 plus 2? Don't look so startled. What is 2 plus 2? This is going to involve much committee work. 2 plus 2 equals? Fantastic. It wasn't a trick question. But who is evaluating the answer? I am, which is why I think you were slightly surprised by my sudden switch to pedagogic relations. And you'll notice the control there. I wasn't letting you off the hook. You're going to answer me. And you'll answer me in my terms that we will have agreed through the pattern of practice in getting to where we are. If I said something like, anyone see anything interesting on the video that they wanted to mention that hasn't been mentioned so far? Anything of any interest at all that you saw?
I like the way that the resources were literally a blank piece of paper, which means that any classroom that had a small amount of money could reproduce that activity.
And this time I'm not adopting a pedagogic relation. I think that's equally interesting, and thank you for pointing it out, and I'm going to think about that too, and so on and so forth. You might even have a gold star, perhaps. But nonetheless, what we have here is a fluctuation from where there is overt evaluation or covert evaluation of the utterance to where we simply allow the person themselves to decide whether what's happening is worthwhile or interesting. And one consequence of putting children to work by themselves is that it might appear that they have more opportunity for self-evaluation and less overt pedagogy. Control in that kind of classroom, compared to the one you were talking about that I had as a student at that age, where the teacher was looking, as I am now, at you and making sure nobody is not listening. There, the control is highly visible. When set to work by yourselves, is there no control? Can you just doodle? Can you do what you like? Well, in some classrooms, that's what happens. So there would be a shift from pedagogic to exchange, or if you like, marketing relations, where the consumer becomes the person who decides whether the time is well spent. And what is interesting about schools education, partly because of the way the world has gone, is that in any educational setting now, apart from really traditional ones, you will see a fluctuation between pedagogic and exchange relations. And that is where contestation happens. And it's quite interesting to watch it. Okay, so next slide. This is the other word I wanted to emphasize, recontextualization. We've had it before. The word to focus on there is the word context. So at the bottom of the slide, we've got recontextualization beneath, well, a separation of academic practice and some other practice, like a classroom. So here you are in the academy, in the university. You're reading all about Piaget and Vygotsky, and then you look at another setting, a maths classroom. You have cast a regard on that other setting. And of course, the way you read it will be through the resources that you have available, and they will be highly discursive. You're going to write 5,000 words about it in What is Education, and then another 20,000 words in your dissertation. Words, 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 highly discursive. But you will partly be describing a practice that is highly tacit, that you can't put into words. You'll partly be describing a practice that is organized by principles that are not the same as yours. So the question is, what is the value of that recontextualization? I believe it does have a value, but it will take a bit of time for us to get to it. Okay. And then finally, before our quiz, this quotation from Wells, who's in alliance with me about the word knowledge. So this is directly from your reading from last week. And a very significant quotation, I think. You will hear the word knowledge endlessly in various ways. Sometimes in a sophisticated way, sometimes in a less sophisticated way. You should be as suspicious of it as our colleague here is of the video evidence that is placed before him, quite rightly. So conceptually, there is an issue with the word knowledge. And Wells says at the bottom of that quotation, knowledge is created and recreated between people as they bring their personal experience and information derived from other sources to bear on solving some particular problem. You can see he's writing in a Vygotskian tradition. This idea, you go to school to have communication with peers and with teachers to be able to acquire new ways of seeing the world, but those emerge through your interaction with others, not in some other way. Right, we're going to have the Mentimeter. So if you've got your fingers on your Mentimeter devices, we have tonight two major prizes. We have Vampire Fang freshly extracted and extra cheeses. These are all Marks and Spencer's, not any old crisps. And we have Halloween party lollipops for the first and second prize. Okay, so if you could log on to Menti. So the code is 481934. Nobody's logged on yet, apparently. Excellent. So this is not part of the test. This is just for interest. So the first thing is good. So it's going to make a word cloud of those words you associate with Piaget. And we'll post these on the Moodle site afterwards. This is very encouraging because you're using the esoteric terms that Piaget uses. That is, you are finding your way into Piagetian thinking by using words like accommodation and assimilation. And stages. I see somebody's put the word knowledge in there. Okay, well, this is really a warm-up exercise, so let's move to the second one. So, same exercise, but now 3 words you associate with Vygotsky/Wells. Ooh, nice. Yes. So scaffolding is appearing several times in one form or another, as is social and dialogue and interaction and social interaction. And this map is very different. So we've now got very interesting to look through later. Please do on Moodle. Compare these 2 maps that have been collectively generated as to where these 2 authors are coming from, or at least how they've been interpreted. Right, now we're going to have the test because 100 of you have got there. Now, there are only two questions, Oren? You didn't add one. Okay, so there are 2 questions because we haven't got a budget for the whole program. Okay, we're not going to wait for longer. That's it. Let's go. Be quick. Oh my lord. Oh my lord, you think Vygotsky put a pigeon in a box to condition it? Well, I think some of you may want to have another review of the reading from last week, or at least have another look at my slideshow. Wow, that's extraordinary. Okay, so this is the interim situation, not the final one. You can always overtake Dragon Slayer with the second question. So the total is from both questions. Oh, well done to most of you, but again, it's divided you pretty effectively there. I have a trick for remembering that one. If you change your frame of reference, it's accommodating. The C in accommodating is the change, whereas assimilated is where you just stick with your established way of seeing. Anyway, we'll now see who has won. With the usual apologies to the online viewers. So, Lizzie, very many congratulations. Where is Lizzie? Lizzie wants to remain anonymous? No? Okay. Okay, well, bad luck to Lizzie. So Lizzie, I'm afraid you'll have to have a virtual suite. Next one. We need to quickly do this. Can you go back? Oh dear. Frank. Anyone here? Frank? No, he's online too, is he? No idea? Oh dear, what a shame. Can we not go back to the leaderboard? Never mind. Well, we will sort that out before the tutorial session. Award prizes accordingly, but we need our 5-minute break now, and then Jacek will talk to you. So thank you very much for your attention.
So, good evening. It's great to be able to welcome Dr. Jacek Brandt. He's giving the lecture this evening on Can Education Be Value Free? Jacek is an associate professor in education at UCL Institute of Education. He's a background of teaching in the economics and business education field. He's got a wealth of international experience. He's been involved in educational projects in Armenia, Australia, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Finland, Japan, Poland, Russia, and South Korea. He's the current head of the Academic Department of Curriculum, Pedagogy and Assessment. He's widely published and has been a consultant and researcher on a range of projects, and he's a member of the Subject Specialist Research Group. And somehow he finds time to teach, tutor and supervise lots of students. So thank you for being with us this evening, Jacek.
Our pleasure. Can I ask, can you hear me okay at the back? Well, not really. Yeah, superb. So I'm posing the question, can education be value free? Maybe it's counterintuitive because a lot of us think we learn maths or history or geography. Where are the values? There's things to learn. And I want to challenge that view that in fact my sort of argument in the next hour is that education is all about values, but we'll explore that. So you're on a module, what is education? The only module with a question mark. It's a neat module. And I do this, I've worked quite a lot on this, on the MA Education program and the What is Education module, not this year because of my other duties, but I'm close to this program and I think it's really good. It's a really great program to get you to think. Most of you are on the MA Education program. Some of you are on different MAs that have chosen this as an option, and that's terrific. What I want to say in the next few minutes is, don't see the modules as separate. They're interconnected, and there's a bit of philosophy in my discussion. I refer to research. So is it an understanding research talk? Not really. I'll hold it. I think that's going to be the. Is it a understanding research talk? No, but I think it's relevant as well. And also think about your dissertation, what you want to actually research and do at the end, because everything you do during the MA is actually interconnected. And so in What is Education, we can ask, what is education for? What are schools for? And in actually doing a research course and preparing to write your dissertation to do some primary research, there are actually paradigms of understanding teaching. There's a behaviorist one, a cognitive one, and a social cultural one. And we'll look at each of those as part of my What is Education talk with you. And so I'm going to talk about philosophy for the next 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll stray back into education per se. When I was writing my doctorate, I was presented with a dichotomy. And the question was asked, are you a positivist? Do you believe the world is objective, external, it's value-free, it's a science, there are fundamental laws that you find, or are you an interpretivist? So what we understand is socially constructed, the observer of research is actually part of the environment, so influences what is being researched. Are you seeking meaning as opposed to objective facts? And for me, that was the wrong question. I was a bit confused. And a little bit later on, I will refer to critical realism, which for me solved that dichotomy, because I believe the world is real and objective, but not necessarily us who understand that world, because we have a subjective understanding of that objective world. So that's the sort of where I'm coming from in terms of philosophy. And I was very fortunate. This is an amazing place, the Institute of Education. Some of your talkers, most of them, are world class, and they travel to other countries to give talks. And we just take it for granted they're just around. So some of the people I became mates with are world-known professors. And Roy Bhaskar, who invented this idea of critical realism, was a colleague and actually part of this department of CPA, Curriculum, Pedagogy and Assessment. He sadly passed away about 4 years ago. And for me, the most important thing, and these are Roy's words, he disambiguated ontology from epistemology. So let me kind of put that into easier terms. When you're writing your dissertation or you're writing one of your assignments, or you're writing the understanding research assignment or your dissertation, you'll think about a method. How am I going to gather data? That's absolutely fine. So it might be quantitative or qualitative, but where are you going to get your data from? What's your strategy? The strategy is called methodology. So you have an approach to actually generating kind of data and research that's coherent. And the two terms in many kind of methods books are used together, ontology and epistemology, and they're different. Ontology is the way the world is, and epistemology is the way we see and interpret the world, and they're different. So there can be a real world, but it can be interpreted by us. And I think that's just a bit of useful background. And Roy, so I'm staying in the world of philosophy here, and Roy says, in fact, reality is stratified. So you can understand it in terms of layers. And what positivists do, they focus on the world of the domain of the empirical, so they access facts and they just deal with facts. And a lot of positivistic research, quantitative research, generates a lot of facts and they look for correlations. But in fact, there are forces at work that we can't see. So if you think about gravity, if I drop a pen, it will fall. But you can't see gravity, but it's a force at work. And in the social world also, there are forces. So in my subject, economics, people talk about forces of supply and demand. You can't see them. Teachers draw graphs of them, but this is hypothetical. But these forces are at work. So for example, the price of something goes up, it might put us off from buying it. But that's a force that affects us. I'm sorry, I'll try and hold it better. And so the domain of the actual are forces that directly affect us. And the domain of the real are potential forces. And just an example, water, it puts out fires, but is made up of hydrogen and oxygen, which are both combustible. So we live in a world where we can see certain things, but there are also forces at work where we try and figure out what's going on. Now, this is one of my favourite cartoons, and I was listening to Russell earlier on, and I thought of this cartoon. And so we got the teacher saying, not sure if they understood the lesson, but I taught it really well. And it shows that difference between teaching and learning. And now what I'd like you to do, discuss in pairs or threes, this half of the room to my right, what are schools for, or what are universities for? What's the purpose of schools or universities? And this half on my left, what education research should we do? Okay, just 2 minutes and we'll get a few answers. What are schools for? What sort of research should we do?
It's one of those ones.
Yeah. Just to listen. Yeah, actually a minute. Maybe one on each side. Just take a few comments. Okay, let's have a couple of suggestions. So from this side of the room, what are schools for, or what are universities for? Any ideas? You're here in a university. What's the purpose? Lady there, talent. Great. So we got two ideas there. Developing the individual. So in some way we want to think better or know things. And the role in society. So the two are interrelated. One is inward looking, one is outward looking. Terrific. Anyone else want to tell us what are schools for or what are universities for? What's the purpose function? So one more idea from this side of the room. Yes.
Increasing knowledge in certain fields, getting qualification to help with filling different jobs.
Super. Increasing knowledge in a field and getting a qualification. Two separate things. So one is credentialism. You pass an exam, you get a qualification, which enables you to either study further or to get a job that you want. And the other is sort of developing the field. So I would think your university with research pushes the boundary of knowledge, and UCL is pretty famous around the world in many fields, from medicine to physics to engineering to education. So on this side of the room now, what sort of research should we do? Any ideas? You had a nice chat. I heard a few people speaking. Over there, Beth.
I think that it should be qualitative rather than quantitative.
And why so?
Because I think it was said in one of the articles, like the teacher, for instance, is one of the most variable components of a classroom, that even if a quantitative study was done, it is exceptionally hard to reproduce. And so you can measure anything and everything you want, but it doesn't actually mean that it would be, it can be something for like extended more generally to every classroom.
Okay, so John Hattie would argue for big quantitative studies. If anyone read the chapter I suggested. And I think there's a place for large quantitative studies. I'm a qualitative researcher, and I think it's much more interesting to find out and develop meaning and learn from individual situations. But thank you. Any other comment on what sort of research should we do? Quantitative, qualitative, or within classrooms? What sort of research might be interesting? Okay, one more, and then we'll...
I think we should do more longitudinal studies into the effects of education initiatives, even the ones that in England come in and disappear again a few years later. But I think tracking the effects of those long term.
I think longitudinal studies are really interesting. What's going on, not at this moment in time, but how things change over years. So this is not education, but there's an interesting study in New Zealand on how people get older. And I don't know if anyone read it in the papers, but they looked at how people walked, their gait, and how fast they walked with relation to aging. They wouldn't have known that without doing a longitudinal study. And there's been quite a few educational longitudinal studies of children who develop into adults and so on. Now, my screen has disappeared, but we're back on. So thank you. And we're going to probe on this now. And I'm going to talk about 3 paradigms of research and teaching, behaviorist, cognitive, and socio cultural. Now, the first one is what governments love. Primarily, it's quantitative research and it's process product. And what this research is, we'll have an intervention and then we'll measure its success. So this is pure Hattie. Government funding is primarily on quantitative studies. It's primarily behaviorist, so it measures a change in the behavior. So you talked about behaviorism, Skinner, Pavlov maybe the other week, and this is the basis of the research. So for instance, we'll do 1 extra hour of homework for children every night and see what the effect is. One of the things, you can't measure learning very well, so you have to have proxies for learning. So it might be a pre-test and post-test, or some sort of examination that would be used. It's based on the scientific model or medical model of research, and very often there are intervention groups and control groups. So one of the ways you could do it is teach some children one way, teach children another way, and see which is the better way. So like if you're testing a drug, you might have 100 people taking a placebo, 100 people taking an actual drug. They don't know if it's a placebo or not. Placebos do work, so people in placebo groups do get better faster because they think they're getting a drug and they naturally get well. But does the real drug have a better effect? And it's similar in educational research, where if you have someone else in the room teaching a different way, then you think it's going to be better and you pay more attention. It's in economics called the Hawthorne effect. I talk in my paper about economics. Can economists set up similar research? No, I don't believe they can, because there's so many variables, and I think it's the same in education. And yet there's an allure to this form of research because it appears to be scientific and precise. So my subject, economics, there's a lot of economists going back to the 1950s and 60s especially that claimed economics was a science, a positive subject. It's about facts. There's no values. You simply find relationships and there you are. And in fact, Milton Friedman, famous economist, said it's a predictive science, and if economists don't predict what will happen in the future, they're shortchanging the reader. I'm quoting Friedman. And so they try to make predictions. If you followed what's happened in Britain about Brexit, one of the big criticisms was experts and economists that they couldn't predict, or they got their predictions wrong. My argument in my own subject is we should not try to predict what's going to happen. We're not very good at it. Not much better than predicting the weather in the future, and it could be just about anything. So economics claims to be value-free science. It's not, in my opinion. Education often goes the same way in big quantitative research studies. I'll give you a new bucket to economics. This is a question from one of the awarding bodies, and it had a statement: the government should increase the national minimum wage to reduce inequality. It's a value statement. Statement 2, a significant increase in the national minimum wage above the market equilibrium wage is likely to cause unemployment. And the best statement, the correct answer for the examination is that the first statement is normative and the second statement is positive. And within the frames of the question, that's a correct answer. But actually, so that's economic theory. Actually, if you look at data from around the world, successful economies, in fact, where there is a high minimum wage, tend to be more affluent and there's less unemployment. And if you look at what happened around the world after 2008, the big financial crash, where governments followed policies of austerity, things went worse and not better. So I actually question my own subject and what's going on. The problem with that, so you might say, well, kind of, so what, economics is not my subject, or the problem is, if you accept a value-free situation where it doesn't exist and impose it onto school classrooms, teachers will tend to teach the models and teach what will be in the exams rather than for deep learning and understanding, and that is a problem. Now, this is oil forecasts from 1980. So these are economists predicting what will happen in the future, and people pay economists a lot of money for these predictions. So you can see the lines from 1980. So what actually, oops, why are my lines not going? So what you've got here is, it's actually not a PowerPoint building up sheet. I think it's, you've got the answer straight away. So if you for a moment ignore the black line to the right of 1980, the predictions at each point were the way things would go, but the reality was actually pretty random in comparison to the predictions. So you have to believe me on that one. Now trying to move slides now. can we make you seeing it? Oh, my screen's gone slightly strange. Is there any way we can get it smaller? Is that the simply? There we go. Sorted. Okay. So we're simply going to move on from here, and I'm going to talk now briefly about the book. Could you put your hand up if you managed to do the chapter reading? Not everyone managed. Thank you. And so when I first came across this book, I thought it was brilliant. I thought this is a really great book with lots of good information. So now I've revised my view. It's quite a good book with some good information, but some massive flaws in it. And the book has actually, to be fair to John Hattie, he's been influential around the world. Governments have treated what he does seriously. But what he's saying is you can have these mega studies and definitively say what works in education. And this is what I'm challenging. So one of the things he talks about is effect sizes, and what I mentioned earlier. So what is the impact of setting 1 extra hour of homework every week on learning? That's the big size. Now, our friend at the back who favoured qualitative research, well, a teacher could do that experiment in their own classroom, setting appropriate homework and actually sort of having some measures of its efficacy. And I think that would be a good thing to do. One of the problems with Hattie is that he looked at all the studies on homework and combined them, and aggregated studies with different assumptions, and then came up with effects. If you actually read the book on homework, it has very little effect on any gain in learning. That's what the study finds. And maybe some classrooms was a positive effect and some classrooms had a negative effect, and it just equaled itself out. We don't know. I think it's worthwhile qualitative research in classrooms. The aggregate of adding up all the different studies and combining them is the mistake. So those of you who've been in this building long enough will know it's either too cold or too hot. You could say over the whole year, on average, it's about right. But what does that mean? It's still too hot or too cold on any one day. The average is fine. And that's what Hattie has done with this book. He's added statistics up that just should not be added together. My argument about Hattie, I'm planning to write a paper on it. It's not ready yet. That his work is actually counter-educational. It actually is quite light on critique. It focuses on measurable outcomes, but a lot of what happens in classrooms is not directly measurable. It's behaviorist. It promotes a regime of control with governments or education authorities telling teachers what to do based on flimsy evidence. It doesn't develop professionality amongst teachers. And the key point is that learning is not always visible, but it still happens and it's still important. It gets worse though. So you've got Hattie talks about effect sizes and big scale data projects. And there's a colleague up at Durham University, Rob Coe. I met him, he's a perfectly nice man, but I don't like this particular conclusion he's come to. And he's measured effect sizes against value for money, against the cost of them. So if you have a look at the left and upwards, he says it's worth it. And if you look towards the right, he's saying small effect sizes and very expensive, it's probably not worth doing. If you look at 3/4 of the way down at the right-hand side, smaller class sizes. So what he's saying is, on the big meta studies, there's no advantage for having smaller class size or a very small kind of learning gain for having small class sizes. They're very expensive, so there's no point having smaller class sizes. So maybe we have bigger class sizes, and there's very little kind of gain from that. Well, is that right? Is it? So I remember when I was a teacher, I had split the students into two groups. So the really bright ones had a group of 35 studying my economics group, who I thought were the brightest, and the parallel group we had 16 in. These are people who are struggling with economics, so we wanted to give them more time and help. So which group did better? The big group or the small group? The big group, because there were really bright people who didn't struggle with their learning. But does that mean that teaching in a bigger group is better than teaching in a smaller group? We're not comparing the same students. And so with small class sizes, if you look at independent private schools, grammar schools, they might have smaller class sizes, but their intake may be different from other students, from other schools with different students. So it's very difficult to make this pronouncement, but that's what the big data says. I think it's problematic. So this is what Robco wrote in a government report. Schools should consider increasing class sizes to free up time and money for teachers to receive proper professional development. Educational experts have suggested, Robco has suggested. Robco, director of the centre at Durham University, said debate needed to be opened up whether class size or better teachers were a priority to the future. I'm mortified by that. What does proper professional development mean? It sounds really plausible. Oh, we'll have bigger class sizes, but we'll give the teachers proper professional development. These are nonsense words, in my opinion. So do we have a debate whether to have better teachers in the future? Well, why not have better teachers and smaller class sizes? It's a nonsense debate, but it seems to set up this argument and justify spending less money on education. This is my worry. So, can education be value-free? That's the title of my talk. And basically, if your philosophical position is that of a positivist, you're into big-scale quantitative studies, you do input-output type research, then education can be value-free. I'm not such a researcher. So, a second paradigm of educational research is cognitive. Cognitive basically means thinking. And the basic premise is that concerns knowledge and the conceptualization of knowledge by teachers or lecturers. And this is when I'm working internationally, this is my frame to design kind of programs or interventions where I get teachers to think. That's the key thing. So rather than saying giving tips for teaching, basically let's set up situations where people have to think about their own practice and what they do and how they might change it. And here, fact-like knowledge is transformed into usable teacher knowledge through pedagogical reasoning. So I was, in my work in Armenia, I was asking the teachers to come up with their own solutions to a problem, and they'd do that, and they'd go, is that answer right? It's the wrong question. It's a solution to a problem within a situation that is genuine and legitimate. Now, I like this quote. So teachers who view students' thinking as a resource for their own learning can develop new understandings of children's thinking through interactions with children in their classrooms. So this is, I actually did a review of a research book, and I wrote this to say, if you as a teacher or an instructor or a lecturer see your students as their thinking as informing your own practice, then it's powerful and you can change your own practice. So I think this is research that's based on changing thinking amongst the participants. Now, I'm going to tell you very briefly about a project I did in one of the Arab countries a few years ago, before Arab Spring. And the brief I was given, the title of the project was called Work Attitude Development. And the country's, the government commissioned a human resource agency They came to the Institute of Education and say, we want an intervention. We want students in the school to be taught that it's wrong to steal pencils, or when you go to work to make personal phone calls, or to be willing to work on holy days because it's good for the firm. And I'm thinking, how could you possibly run a course with school children to actually change the way they act when they leave school? So I thought it was an impossible task. I didn't want to do it, but my director persuaded me to. And I decided I didn't want a nation of children hating me, so I designed a course that was fun and based on moral dilemmas. So it was very active, practical, and students were given scenarios they had to make decisions. To work in a group and think, we want to do this. This is because. And I thought having something like that was much more powerful than simply telling children not to steal pencils from when they get employed the next year. So the point was, this is what I wrote for the teachers, guide for the teachers who ran this course in Arabic. During the classes, students will explore their own values, learn to listen to others' ideas, work in teams, be creative, but most of all, they'll have fun. And the course did go down well. Whether they stole pencils from work when they left, I don't know. But at least they thought about it and the moral dilemmas behind it. So when I've worked abroad, it's been based on trying to get teachers to think why they do things, to justify that. The third one, more powerful than that, is recognizing that you're working in a social, cultural situation. Classrooms are communities, they have their own culture, they have their own history, and that teaching is fundamentally interactional. And so I try to get teachers to work in their own context and tell me the answers rather than me imposing, kind of social, cultural, Western view on them. Depends on their cultural context. They work out the problems, we talk through them. And so my argument is learning really can only be understood within a larger systems. Classroom can be seen as communities, their own culture and history. So being an economics and business teacher, this is something that I used to teach my students, but I think it's of importance to everyone. And this is a psychologist, American psychologist, Abraham Maslow, and he conceptualized a hierarchy of needs, of human needs. And at the bottom are physiological needs. So we need food and water to survive. But then we have needs of safety and security. So we want to be healthy. We don't want to be attacked. We want to be protected. We want to get on with our work and social time in peace. But also we want to be kind of loved and have a sense of belonging, sense of family, a sense of being liked, a sense of doing something well. And with that, and maybe employment and doing well grows self-esteem, and some people seek self-actualization, maybe a spiritual trip of self-discovery to become better people. But it's very hard to be on a trip of self-discovery if you're hungry. And so these needs are hierarchical. And so I want to share with you a classroom dialogue that happened. Colleague, she's no longer at the Institute of Education, Tamara Bibi. She researched primary school classrooms around the UK and wrote a report about them. And I was shocked by reading this and deeply moved. So I'll read you some background here. So the class had been given a short test, and so these are young children, and was working through the answers together. The teacher, Mrs. Norton, seemed annoyed, although why was not clear. She pursued children for answers, seemed unconcerned about how they got them, unlike the excellent video clip we saw earlier, where the teacher was very concerned about how the teachers got the answers. She didn't seem to be. And after a series of apparently frustrating exchanges, she asked Muhi how many 5 pences there are in a pound. It's not a dissimilar exercise to the other class. He did not know.
At this point, rather than offering hints, guidance, or encouragement, she asked a series of sarcastic questions that seemed geared at making Muhi feel foolish. How many 5p's make a pound? I don't know. Muhi, do you know anything about money? So he's feeling awkward. Do you go to the shops? Have you seen a 2p? Have you seen a 5p coin? So she as a teacher made Muhi feel horrible. I'd imagine he didn't want to go to school the next day. He was confused, he was worried, he felt bad. Some of his friends were having a go at him, making fun of him. Who else would want to answer in that sort of classroom climate? I'm just going to go back a slide. And so the physiological needs, the safety needs, they're not just physical safety, they're mental safety. And classrooms and lecture theatres are places where as human beings we need to feel safe. And to say that education is not about values, or economics says it's all about facts and learning facts, is a nonsense if you simply consider a human interaction and our need to feel safe, to feel a sense of belonging. And if you're doing well in your learning, kind of self-esteem and confidence and wanting to learn more and going back to school. I'm not accusing my late mother's carer's daughter's teacher of being like Mrs. Norton, but what she experienced was horrible. 7-year-old girl who liked going to school for 2 years was then faced with staying behind at lunchtime because she didn't do well enough in her SATs tests and the school didn't want to do badly. So a little girl who loved learning started to fear school and started to be ill and stopped going to school for a while. And that's horrible. But it's about these neutral exams that test students' progress, or is it neutral and value-free? I don't think so. So I'm asking again, can education be value-free? And I say if your philosophy is interpretivist, your approach to learning socially constructivist, and you prefer qualitative research to quantitative research, then education is all about values. Now, you've listened to me talking for a long time, and we're going to have an activity for about 10 minutes. So if we could ask my trusty helpers, there'll be 2 separate activities on this side and on this side. So you basically draw a house. If you want to draw my house, and this is my second house that I have in the countryside as a retreat, you're welcome to, or you can draw your own house. But you've got instructions on the piece of paper to follow. So I'll go around, talk to you the next sort of 7 or 8 minutes. We've got 10 minutes for this activity to draw a house. Okay, I'm going to stop it a little early because I realise I'm running out of time. So on this side, you had a very defined marking scheme. Yeah? So you could get 10 out of 10 by following the rules, and many of you got 10 out of 10. Now I'm going to ask you on this side, and if there's a mic around for someone, how did it feel to do that exercise? How did it feel?
It was straightforward because he had instruction. We had our instruction to follow.
Yeah,
So,
straightforward. So no stress?
no.
Good. Anyone feel stressed on this side?
So for me, it was less like stressful, but really limiting. Like I looked at how many marks I could get for a window, and therefore drew 4 because that was my maximum. So like limitations on what I could actually
So
do.
couldn't you do 6 windows or 10 windows?
Well, I could, but what's the point if I'm not getting marks?
So this is a really important point. What's the point if I'm not going to get marks for it? So one lady only did 2 windows, a beautiful house. She got 8 out of 10. But it was a nicer house than other people who got 10 out of 10 because she kind of cared and put a lot into it. But the mark scheme said 8 out of 10, that's what she got. Now, this gentleman did a terrific house, but it had no walls. Still got 10 out of 10. It had windows, it had a door, but it had no walls. Now, can I ask the same question to here? Because you didn't have a mark scheme, and I'd like to just ask a couple of people how they felt about drawing a house. You've got a gentleman at the back.
I hated it.
Well, why? Yeah, why?
I don't draw. I hate drawing. I could have described it for you. I would have done an interpretive dance for you.
Yeah.
But I hate drawing.
Now, so it can get scary. So if you hate drawing and you're on that side, you'd have been safe.
Oh, I'm very envious of all of these people.
They're
now
just
on my list.
do they could do their bit and they get 4 marks and that's it, and they didn't have to worry about it. But here, it put stress on you because you had to.
It was
do
just
something
aimless. It was just draw a
creative.
house. I don't care.
Terrific. Someone else, please.
I felt, speaking of envy, I felt a bit jealous of what other people put in their house because I'd forgotten it. I'd forgotten what my dream house was. So I felt stressed from comparing my drawing to others.
So you actually start, rather than addressing the criteria, you were actually comparing with others?
Absolutely.
And
when I glanced over, I thought, oh, I'd forgotten my garage, I'd forgotten my jacuzzi, I'd forgotten my...
So people had a garage, swimming pool,
Yeah.
or a really fancy modern house
Hammocks,
with a roof terrace. Fantastic. Did anyone love the exercise here?
Yeah.
And why so?
I had tunnel vision. I had an image and was just in my own head and not really concerned because there were no parameters. I could just do whatever I wanted and found pleasure in that.
Terrific. And isn't it strange? You were asked to draw a house. On this side, people felt constrained. There was no constraint about drawing the house, but because there was a mark scheme, you just felt obliged to do what was asked and no more. And here, and I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong, they're just different experiences. And here you had the freedom to do what you liked, and if you're an artist and have a vivid imagination, you can have great fun. If you're not an artist, it can be quite stressful because it's not quite clear what's expected of you. And so, in terms of understanding curriculum, I kind of appreciate we've not got a lot of time left. We've got sort of 5 or maybe stretch 10 minutes. That's terrific. If you see curriculum in terms of assessment, then the way the assessment works is crucial in terms of the outcomes, even though the exercise was the same. And in examination systems, we talk about kind of having a behaviorist view of teaching or a social constructivist view of learning, and we talk about curriculum and pedagogy. The assessment has such an impact on what we do, and our education systems can really shape the way teaching and learning might actually look. Now, what I'm quickly going to go through is kind of shaping what shapes a curriculum and what might shape the values of a curriculum. And we've dealt with the last one, the assessment point. We'll have a quick look at the other 3 models. Now, those of you who are familiar with the English system, you probably think and breathe learning objectives or learning outcomes. And what I see in a lot of classrooms, especially nowadays rather than 10 or 15 years ago, is the teacher saying, today we will learn X, Y, and Z. Please copy these intended learning outcomes. And very often at the end of the lesson, there's a review of what was learned in the intended learning outcomes. So an outcomes is just one way of conceptualizing curriculum. But all curricula will have elements of the 4 I mentioned, but you can get obsessed with preconditions of what will be learned, and there's little space, there's not enough space perhaps for creativity or free thinking. I love the work of Lawrence Stenhouse from the 1970s. He wrote a book that was called The Curriculum Project, and the strong focus was on process. So this is kind of about thinking, solving problems, exploring issues. And one of the talks you'll have later in the series is on an aims-based curriculum, which is simply a different way of thinking about organising a school curriculum. And it's interesting. It's not right, it's not wrong. It's just a different lens and a different view of how curricula might be organised. And I'll move, whoops, sorry, I'm going too fast here. And what I want to spend just a few minutes on is how we might look at educational values within a curriculum. So there's things to learn. You might state intended learning outcomes. There'll be a process of learning and thinking, and there'll be an assessment of learning. That's a feature of all curricula. But why? Why school? Why university? And I'm offering three separate conceptualizations of the value. I asked right at the start of the talk, one half said, what are schools for, what are universities for, and the others, what sort of assessment do we do? It's all about understanding that in terms of these three elements. So one element is education as an investment. And very often governments talk about preparing people for the world of work. And you individually, you might think about passing examinations to get a better job. And there's nothing wrong with this. So the one purpose of schooling is so you can get qualifications, you can get a good job, and for the economy to work well. That's fine. There's another very different conceptualization of educational values, and that's education as an enrichment of experience. And by that I mean that there are subjects that are worth studying for their own sake. So to be an educated person, you should know some history of your own country, of the world, some geography, capitals of countries, where countries are, and so on. And it's important to know a bit of science, some literature. So there are things worth studying for their own sake. Very often they're examined. So you might become a historian, pass exams in history. But the point is, you're not learning for exams, you're learning for the sake of understanding subjects because they're worth knowing and they're worth passing on. And there's a third conceptualization, education as an end in itself. It's good to be educated, it's good to learn, it's healthy, and you learn because it's good to learn. And the slogan is lifelong learning. And so I think they're all really important, but they're all different and they're not mutually exclusive. So you could go to school, you love learning, you love your subject, you pass an exam, you get a good job, they can all work harmoniously together, but they are different conceptualizations of value. First is monetary, the last is, in terms of Maslow's triangle, about developing as a human being, all important. And just going to finish soon. So I'm teaching, right, Maslow's curriculum, I think. So now I'm going backwards. This is why I've got myself confused. I'm now going to go forwards. So, teaching with values. Teacher, a professional who has a love of that which is to be taught, maybe a subject, who understands learning, understands students, has pedagogical expertise to put together subject and relationship to students, and has an ethical disposition for the best interests of the learners. And I'm going to end now with kind of a sad but inspiring quote from an American head teacher who survived the concentration camps during the Second World War. And he writes to his new teachers in his school. I'm a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no man should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers. Children poisoned by educated physicians. Infants killed by trained nurses. Women and children shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I'm suspicious of education. My request is help your students to become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, arithmetic are important, but only if they serve to make our children more human. Thank you for listening. I think What is Education is a terrific module. Enjoy it. Get the different views from the different speakers each week. And that's it. Thank you.
I'm happy to take any questions. At this time, take good questions. Good question.
So we've still got time for a few questions for Czech. If anybody would like to indicate, yeah, that's. Can we have some more? I have another microphone here for somebody.
Thank you. Your original critique of the large data set was that it hadn't been combined correctly, as I understood it, and therefore its conclusions were suspicious at best. Given the timing when that analysis took place, and given the advances in modelling with large data sets, is it not an equally valid response to say that we should go back to the original data and recast it, and then maybe there is a quantitative analysis that can be made?
Let me say, I'm not against quantitative analysis. The problem with Hattie's book is its meta-analysis. So different studies, which in their own right are correct, they might have limitations, but they're correct, are combined. So there's no work you can do to make them better because you're combining different studies with different researchers, with different methodologies to come up with an answer. So the analogy might be, on a statistical level, it's just wrong. Now, that's not to say that there are not worthwhile quantitative studies in education, because they are, but they tend to give very kind of broad, crude correlations. But that's not to say, so for example, of value is studies that show the best way to improve educational results is to actually reduce inequality. So societies with a lot of inequality, where areas are very poor, tend to do worse. Now, that's not an excuse for children or parents not to have high expectations. And on smaller studies, you can show that when areas of high poverty, schools that have really high expectations of their students succeed. But the major way of improving performance is to reduce inequality. So that's actually of value to a society and to learning. And to tackle, on the one hand, causes of inequality, but that's a big political decision. But on the other hand, to have interventions, for example, breakfast clubs. So if children are hungry, they're not going to study very well. So what a school can do is create a breakfast club so children come in, they eat breakfast, and they're in a better place to learn.
Thank you.
Hi. What is your opinion about multiple intelligences? Because as far as I know, there haven't been any quantitative research done on that theory. So should there be a research, quantitative research?
Right. So there has been research, but it's flawed. It's a poor concept. So it had its moment, flavor of the month. So I can recommend work by Frank Coffield, which he trashes the idea of multiple intelligences. The whole concept of intelligence is flawed, that we have this set fixed intelligence that can be measured. And the idea of multiple intelligences, for instance, you might have musical dispositions or dispositions to creative thinking and divergent thinking rather than convergent thinking. What intelligence tests did in the 1950s when they were designed was basically measure convergent thinking, so a form of thinking. But to then base a system of grammar schools and secondary moderns and technical schools on an exam for age 10 in England and similar exams in other countries is actually massively flawed. So there's a concept, for example, of children underachieving. So in other words, they do really well on an intelligent, they're intelligent, but they actually do very badly exams, or overachieving. Children with low IQ seem to be doing really well. And these are not contradictory. It's a flaw in testing, or this idea of a fixed intelligence. There was a fad in the 1990s in England to label children as specific type of learners based on, this flawed idea of multiple intelligence. And it's just, there's no mileage in it. there is mileage in teaching, having a variety of teaching approaches, because we learn differently in different circumstances. But the idea of intelligence is flawed. The idea of creativity as a way to be able to teach creativity is flawed. The idea is to basically know your subject, relate to the students, and have a variety of approaches. That's the way to go. Time for one more question, and a lady here.
I'm wondering, is education a social science or humanities?
So both are labels. So it can be labelled as a social science or a humanity or a subject in its own right. And I wouldn't worry about it. It's what it is. To understand classrooms and educational settings is complex with a lot of factors involved. Teachers are amazing people. Good teachers can transform boring subjects and make them alive. An hour or 2 hours can go so quickly. So however we label it doesn't matter. But it's not an easy thing to do. That's what I would say.
Okay. Thank you so much, Yashak,
Thank you.
for such an interesting presentation. He's given us a huge amount to think about. So just join me in thanking him once again, please.
And as if by magic, the tutorial room's up on the PowerPoint. So we'll say in 10 minutes.
Okay, but
10
also,
minutes.
can everyone please check the list, because some people's groups have changed. Because if you weren't officially enrolled, you might previously, and you were allocated a group, you might be in a different group now. So everyone should probably check the list at the back.
Please make sure you have signed the register. Please be sure.